Al Jazeera Podcasts.
If there's one thing that I would love for the world to understand is that making people negotiate with the party that's more powerful when they literally have a gun to your head is not a recipe for success.
Diana Buttu is a human rights lawyer and analyst. She was a former legal advisor to the PLO and a defender of the Palestinian cause. We're chatting together in Doha, where the Gaza ceasefire deal was recently agreed. Questions about the stability of the agreement have already been in the headlines, with concerns it won't last without a political process. Will the Israel-Hamas deal hold? I want to know how negotiations are agreed and what it takes to get an agreement, especially on a topic like Israel-Palestine. I'm Samantha Johnson, and this is Now You Know. We're dedicated to amplifying women's voices, stories, and topics we're all thinking and talking about. This is a safe space where we go all in, so by the end of each episode, you can say, "Now I know." Diana Buttu has been involved in high-level negotiations around Palestinian refugees in the past, and she knows what it's like to be the only woman in the room. Buttu was also one of the lawyers credited for taking the issue of Israel's separation wall to the International Court of Justice. So, Diana, thank you so much for joining us in the studio and talking to us on Now You Know.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. It's very nice to be here.
Well, I do want to start our conversation with the ceasefire agreement between Israel and Hamas. Now, I'm intrigued to know, because of your background and experience as an international human rights lawyer and a former negotiator, what does this ceasefire mean to Palestinians in Gaza and in the occupied West Bank?
The idea that Palestinians need to negotiate the end of their genocide is quite repugnant. The idea that we have to negotiate for bombs to stop falling on our heads and for bombs to stop targeting Palestinian hospitals and schools and universities and homes and kids, it's quite repugnant. It's a perverse system. Since the ceasefire has been announced, there's been Palestinians, particularly in Gaza, have felt a measure of relief. They're now able to go and try to dig out their dead, because many people are still trapped under the rubble. I've had friends who've called me and said, "Can you check with the Israelis if they're holding my friends, my families?" I have other friends who've been posting on social media pictures of their loved ones, and they know they're dead, asking for people to just give them information about where they're buried so that they can go and pay their respects to them. And then there's others where people are thinking about how to go home, but it's not really a home. All you see is massive amounts of rubble. It's apocalyptic. And despite that, people are feeling a measure of relief because, again, they don't have the bombs dropping on their heads. The feeling that I and others have is that Netanyahu is the only way that he can stay in office is if he continues genocide or if he continues to attack Palestinians. This is the formula.
What happens to his political career?
One would hope that he'd be finished, and not only be finished politically, but that he would end up being tried before the International Criminal Court. But I just don't see that that's on the horizon, certainly not with President Trump, and certainly not with an Israeli polity that doesn't see that he's done any wrong.
When the ceasefire was announced, again, as a former negotiator, what was going through your mind?
Having read the agreement and seen many, many drafts of it, there are so many gaps in this agreement. And it's an agreement that's going to rely on goodwill, primarily on the Israeli side. The other thing that struck me is in the agreement, they talk about bringing in 600 trucks a day into the Gaza Strip. Again, why is it that Palestinians have to negotiate the number of trucks and the humanitarian aid?
Israel has put a ban on UNRWA, the agency that's been helping Palestinians for decades. Can you just remind our audience why they've taken that decision and what it means for Palestinians.
So the Israelis passed two laws. One law is to shut down its operations in Jerusalem. And the other is that the Israeli government and Israeli officials will no longer coordinate or cooperate with people from UNRWA. And what that means is that the hundreds of thousands of Palestinians who rely on UNRWA's support in the Gaza Strip, we're talking about more than 50% of the humanitarian aid that's being distributed by UNRWA. This is food supplies. Not coordinating with UNRWA means that food is just not going to come in. In the West Bank, we're talking about medicines. We're talking about schools. We're talking, and also in the Gaza as well. And so it's not clear. But that's the whole point, is that Israel wants to get rid of UNRWA because they believe that by getting rid of UNRWA, they will get rid of the Palestinian refugee issue. They won't. And I haven't seen this chorus of countries coming forward and saying to Israel, excuse me, you can't do this.
Soon after the ceasefire came into effect, Israeli forces raided homes in Jenin, in the occupied West Bank. What do you make of that?
Their whole point is to just terrify Palestinians in the hopes that they will leave. I remember very clearly, sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night from it, when the Israelis came into my own home and kicked me out of my home at gunpoint and took over my home for several days and used neighbors as human shields. I'm telling you, I'll never forget it. This was back in 2002. Heard the tanks rolling into the city of Ramallah, where I lived. Saw a tank just outside of my window. I lived in an apartment building. I heard them smash through the glass door, which was the entrance into our apartment building. And the next thing I heard was my neighbor, who came over and with all dignity rang the doorbell and said to me, "Deanna, they want you to come out." They forced me out as they were shooting. I got into my car and drove the wrong way on a one-way street with me flashing the entire time, terrified that a tank was that they were gonna shoot me. And drove halfway across the town in Ramallah, where I sought shelter with some other friends and remained there for days and days and days on end. When I came back to the building about a week later, I found everything from, the shattered glass, which my neighbors had very kindly cleaned up, to the spray paint was still on the door and remained there forever. And I never really talk about it because I feel it's never really about me. But it's to let you know that if I, almost 23 years later, and still wake up in the middle of the night from this, and I'm safe, I wasn't harmed. Just imagine what it's doing to children. And imagine what it's doing to other people as well. And this, for me, was one time. For them, this is successive and repetitive, and it's done over and over and over again.
Is this the reason why you took this particular path to being an international human rights lawyer?
I think it followed me rather than the other way around. I definitely was obviously interested in Palestine, and I had studied law and then wanted to do something in Palestine. But initially, when I moved to Palestine, it was only to be for 1 year. I arrived in September of 2000, and the Intifada, the Palestinian uprising, had just started, and I was in shock by everything that I was witnessing and the brutality that the Israelis were meting out against Palestinians. And that, in a way, also, I said to myself, I just can't go back to Canada. I was born and raised in Canada. I just can't go back. You get this feeling that I have to stand with my people. During that 1 year where where I was living in the West Bank, it was everything from from witnessing the brutality of the way in which soldiers were operating, to then putting up checkpoints and the way that they were brutal towards Palestinians there, to Israel's use of the Apache helicopter on Palestinians in Ramallah, to witnessing in Gaza the Israelis assassinate somebody.
You witnessed that?
I saw it. Yeah, the second time I was ever in Gaza. To then having to be pushed into rooms with the very officials who were calling the shots on these assassination policies and on these torture policies and the policies of building settlements and the policies of building checkpoints.
We're going to talk about your career as a negotiator as well, but the fact that you're the only woman in those rooms, how did you compute that? How did it feel knowing what you've lived through? Did it ever feel surreal because those two worlds were clashing?
All the time. So watching that and then being in the room with these people who are calling the shots and who are trying to be chummy with you and trying to be buddy-buddy with you, and somehow having to carve out in your brain this space that says, okay, this is compartmentalized and this is not. And that was really difficult for me and continues to be very difficult for me. That isn't to say that I don't know how to be a professional, but being a professional doesn't mean that I erase the human. In fact, quite the opposite. The only way that I'm a professional is because I am human. I have these emotions and I have these feelings and I've had these lived experiences, and I'm not going to shove them in some sort of a can and close off the can and pretend that it didn't happen. Because by doing that, you ignore the real harm that is created.
Did you ever think that by you going down this route, being a negotiator, going down the law route, that it would help?
Oh, yeah. That was the initial thing was, I was young and I was naive. Very quickly that faded. I also had a lot of internal debates. I went from being the young, naive, it's just a question of law, and to then realizing that it's not a question of law.
That switch, when did you realize
Pretty
that?
Pretty early on, I would say maybe January of 2001, particularly at the top of talks when I saw the kind of the arrogance of the Israelis, the Israeli negotiators, and the ways in which they were dealing with Palestinians. What the Israelis want is they want Palestinian acquiescence. They don't want a deal. They don't want to leave. The problem for me during that period was that there's nobody else. The Europeans were there. They didn't do anything. The Americans were at these negotiations. They did nothing. They just said, we're going to shove the two of you in a room together and let's just hope you get along and sign some sort of an agreement. And that just does not work. It doesn't make sense that as you're being beaten up, that you're going to be negotiating with the person who's doing the beating. It just logically doesn't make sense.
So was it harder than you thought it was going to be?
It was more frustrating.
Oh, okay.
More frustrating. It wasn't difficult. At one point, the Israelis were showing a map of the West Bank, and one of the people who they had who was their map maker was an Israeli settler. And so he presented this map, and it's not at all a coincidence that the map where the border went around his settlement, and his settlement was going to be part of Israel. And all of these villages that were caught in between were somehow going to be we don't even really know what was going to happen to them. And I remember talking to him about it, and he looked at me kind of stunned and said, Of course my settlement's going to be part of Israel. Of course. Why would you even ask? And so it was these kinds of things of the ridiculous ways in which they behaved. One negotiator said to me that there's no such thing as international law. It's a figment of my imagination. Other negotiations where we would literally have to meet somewhere, and the Israeli soldiers would stop us at a checkpoint for hours on end, for hours on end. And you have to ask, well, who's going to be at a checkpoint? Who's going to see this other than other Palestinians? And the whole point was to show other Palestinians, look, we're even controlling your negotiators. Don't you even dare think that you're going to get anything from us.
Just to stay on your experience as a negotiator, being the only woman in the room, there are going to be other women watching this, and maybe they've been the only woman in the room, the only woman of color. Can you tell us your experience?
At times, I was treated like a little pet, oh, so how cute. And then at times it was exactly the opposite, where there was a reckoning that I was there for a reason. And so it was a mixed experience. I have to be honest and say, look, the world is a world, or at least the world I've lived in, is a world that is not favorable or kind to women. It's a world that really still values men and undervalues women's labor. It's a world in which women are constantly having to prove themselves and are constantly given the additional burdens that many men get away with. And so that's across the board, I think. But when it came to being in that room, as I said, there were times where I was treated as though, like, oh, you're here to take notes.
How did you respond to that?
I knew how to say things like, my handwriting isn't the best. These, because you don't know how to navigate this, to then becoming a little bit more confident and saying, that's not why I'm here. And yes, I'm going to take notes, but not for the reasons that you think. I don't even know if it's, like the condescending part mostly came from people who were outside. And I say this because Palestinian women have always been at the forefront of the struggle. So the Palestinian movement is used to seeing women. It was the Israelis who imposed on us this idea that somehow, oh, how exotic that there's women.
Why do Palestinians have to negotiate?
That's the whole problem.
For fundamental rights.
This is the fundamental problem, is that the world has not stepped in. And the world has said to us as Palestinians, you are going to have to sit down with your abuser, your occupier, the person who's committed genocide, and you're going to have to come to a deal. This is where it's so flawed. If there's one thing that I would love for the world to understand, is that making people negotiate with the party that's more powerful when they literally have a gun to your head is not a recipe for success.
Okay, I'd like to focus on the ICC's arrest warrants for the Israeli and Hamas officials. Can you just tell us what the process is, and is it an effective route to go down?
I personally believe it took them far too long to get to the point where they announced the arrest warrants. Remember, they announced the arrest warrants in May of 2024. And they announced that they were seeking them in May of 2024. Now, why was that so late? Because the genocide had been underway for 7 months, and there was ample evidence that the Israelis were committing genocide. For genocide to take place, for there to be a legal finding of genocide, people often think that it's just the mass killing of people. That's not it. It's whether they have put into place measures that make sure that life cannot be sustained. And that includes everything from targeting the healthcare system to the policies of starvation, to the ways in which the Israelis were killing Palestinian children when they knew they were children. So the problem was that it took the prosecutor 7 whole months to get to the point where he was announcing that he was seeking these arrest warrants. Well, then it took another 6 months for him to actually issue the arrest warrants. When it came to Putin, it was almost automatic that the arrest warrant was issued when it came to his actions in Ukraine. The next step is the part that I fear the most, which is how. So far, we've already heard that a number of countries are already saying that they won't carry out these arrest warrants. What message does it send when you have countries like France and Hungary and the United States saying that they won't implement these arrest warrants? It means that Palestinian life is cheap.
How have you felt about the international community?
Oh, where do I begin? I think the first thing is for me to step back and realize that the international community is not the West. The love that I and so many others have felt from people around the world is overwhelming. But then when you get down to the diplomatic level, and in particular Western diplomats, this is where I'm the most disappointed and angry. Disappointed because when you study international law and you learn that this system of laws was created to prevent and stop genocide, that's what you learn. And then you see it in practice. And you see that these Western nations did nothing to prevent it, because it could have been prevented, by the way. So my anger is the fact that I spent all of these years investing in a system that has proven to be a failure. And the fact that they have done nothing. And, you know, when you're a Palestinian, in particular a Palestinian who lives in Israel, which is where I live, you live under a system of Jewish supremacy. People who are Jewish have superior rights and you have inferior rights. And the one thing that I expected from the world was that they wouldn't be part of this whole system of supremacy.
We're recording this a few days after US President Donald Trump's inauguration.
Yes.
His pick for the UN ambassador to the US is Elise Stefanik, a woman who says that Israel has biblical dominion over the occupied West Bank. Donald Trump has also lifted US sanctions on Israeli settlers in the occupied West Bank and described himself as Israel's protector. Are you surprised?
Not at all. It's not at all surprising that he's nominated Elise Stefanik to be this person, because what I think he's going to do this time around is he's going to fulfill the wish list. I think that he's also going to make sure that the Palestinian Authority is folded. I think he's going to allow a massive ethnic cleansing process. Because when you hear somebody say that Israel has a biblical right to the West Bank, that means that we as Palestinians are the ones who are illegal, and that's not right. That's not the case. I don't think this ceasefire agreement came without a reward to Netanyahu. I think that it came with some pressure and with a reward. And that reward is everything from building and expanding settlements, to allowing annexation, to pushing for ethnic cleansing, to allowing Israel to continue to bomb Gaza, to pushing for normalization, to pushing for the dismantlement of UNRWA, to pushing for the end of the Palestinian Authority. I think that they very much have a plan in mind. And I'm not surprised.
Will the occupied West Bank be the new Gaza?
That's exactly my fear. You know, I live with this, as Palestinians, you have to live with two things all the time. This weird hope that things are going to get better, because that's the only way you can stay alive. And then with the realization that tomorrow is going to be worse than today. So how do you juggle that? The other thing is that we're always pushing back against these Israeli tactics, two main ones, of instilling fear and instilling depression, making you feel like it's hopeless. So when you ask me what's going to happen to the West Bank, on the one hand, I know that the Israelis are going to do to the West Bank what they did to Gaza. They already are. We already see it. And yet, I have to also say that I know that we're going to be free one day. I know that this system is not sustainable. I know that as Palestinians, stubborn Palestinians, that we will see freedom. It's just a matter of time. And it's a matter of whether the world stops them. And yet, I also know that we're going to be free. I do know that. I feel it. Maybe it's because I have to feel it in order to continue. But I do feel it.
Diana Buttu, thank you.
Thank you.
So now you know what Palestinians in the occupied West Bank and Gaza are experiencing after the ceasefire was announced and what goes on behind the scenes in negotiations. Thank you to Diana Buttu for joining us in the studio. And of course, thank you for watching and listening to Now You Know.